She was 7 years old, small for her age, with thin arms and a dress that had been washed so many times the flowers on it had faded to ghosts of themselves. Her name was Ilara, and she lived with her mother in a single room at the top of a crooked building in the oldest part of the city. The city was called Valdris, and it was a place of grand stone avenues and towering statues of old kings, a place where the royal palace sat on a hill like a glittering crown, visible from every corner. To Ilara, the palace was not a symbol of power or history. It was simply where her mother went every morning. Her mother was a laundress for the palace. She worked in the vast, steamy kitchens, not scrubbing pots, but handling the endless mountains of linen, the tablecloths stained with wine, the napkins of royalty, or the bed sheets of visiting dignitaries. She would leave before dawn, when the city was still dark and the only light came from the occasional oil lamp sputtering in a niche. Ilara would wake to the soft click of the door, the rustle of her mother's worn shawl, and the faint, lingering smell of lye soap that clung to her clothes. Then she would curl back into the warmth of their thin blanket, listening to the distant clatter of the first milk carts on the cobblestones. The days were long and lonely. Ilara was too young to work, and there was no money for a school. She spent her time on the roof. It was a flat, precarious space, surrounded by a low, crumbling wall. From there, she had a perfect, unobstructed view of the palace. It rose up tier after tier of honey-colored stone, with its rows of arched windows, its flying buttresses, and the 4 slender towers that pierced the sky. She could see the main gate, a massive arch of iron and oak, flanked by 2 guards in their polished silver breastplates and high black boots. They stood as still as the statues in the square, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their helmets. They never seemed to move, never seemed to blink. Ilara would watch them for hours. She invented names for them. The one on the left, who was a little broader in the shoulder, she called Gregor. The one on the right, who stood just a fraction of an inch taller, she called Stefan. She would wave at them, a tiny, hopeful figure on a distant rooftop. They never waved back. She would stand on her tiptoes and make grand, sweeping gestures, pretending to be a general commanding an army. They remained unmoved. To them, that she was just another smudge of life in the vast, teeming city below, invisible and insignificant. But Ilara didn't mind. Their steadfast presence was a comfort. They were the silent, unchanging guardians, not just of the palace, but of her mother, who was somewhere inside those honey-colored walls. The rhythm of her life was set by the bells of the city's great cathedral. They marked the hours, and Ilara had learned to tell time by them. The morning bells were bright and quick. The midday bells were long and sonorous, and the evening bells, the ones that tolled as the sun began to sink behind the palace towers, were the most important. That was when her mother would come home. Ilara would watch the small service gate to the side of the main entrance, a humble wooden door used by the countless servants who kept the palace running. She would wait, her heart beating a little faster with each passing minute, until she saw a familiar stooped figure emerge, trudging up the steep, winding street towards their home. Her mother would be exhausted, her hands red and raw, her back aching. But she would always have a small smile for Ilara. Sometimes she would bring a treasure, a half-eaten pastry from a noble's breakfast tray, a candle stub that still had some wax left, or a story. The palace was full of stories, her mother said, of whispered conversations in corridors, of arguments behind closed doors, of the cold, distant beauty of the queen and the frail, sickly young prince who was never seen. One evening, her mother's story was different. She didn't smile. She sat on the edge of their one chair and held Ilara's hands, her grip tighter than usual. Her face, but usually just tired, was etched with a deep, unfamiliar worry. "My little bird," she began, her voice a dry whisper. "Something is wrong in the palace. Very wrong." Ilara's eyes widened. "What is it, Mama?" Her mother glanced towards the door as if afraid someone might be listening in the cramped hallway. "It's the young prince," she said, lowering her voice even further. "He's very sick. But they are not calling for the royal physician, not the one we know. A different man comes, a secret man, with hard eyes and a black carriage with no markings. He brings him potions. They make the prince sleep. They make him weak." Elara didn't fully understand. Is the bad man trying to make him better? Her mother shook her head slowly. "No, my love. I don't think he is. I saw the prince yesterday just for a moment. His nurse had stepped away. I was collecting the linens. He looked at me. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He's not getting better. He's fading. And they are keeping everyone away. They dismissed his favorite old nurse last week. They say it's for his own protection, to give him peace and quiet. But it feels like a prison." The word hung in the air between them. Prison. Elara thought of the guards, Gregor and Stefan, standing so still and strong at the main gate. They were there to protect the royal family, weren't they? To keep danger out. But what if the danger was already inside? What if the person who was supposed to be protecting the prince was the one who was hurting him? That night, Elara couldn't sleep. She lay on their thin mattress, listening to the creaks of the old building and her mother's troubled, restless breathing beside her. She stared at the small window, where a single star was visible, and thought about the boy in the palace. He was probably about her age. He had everything in the world: a golden room, silken clothes, toys beyond imagining, but he was a prisoner, growing weaker by the day. And she, a little girl in a faded dress on a rooftop, was free. The injustice of it burned in her small chest. The next morning, after her mother left, Elara went to the roof. But she didn't just watch the guards this time. She studied the palace with a new intensity. She traced the lines of the walls, the position of the windows, the route her mother took to the small service gate. She saw a window on the 3rd floor, set back in a little alcove, that was always open just a crack. It was different from the others, which were kept tightly shut. It was smaller, plainer. A servant's window, or perhaps a prisoner's. She watched the man her mother had spoken of. A black carriage, sleek and unmarked, would arrive at a different gate, one not visible from the main square. A tall, thin man in a dark coat would step out, always looking around, always moving with a furtive, hurried step. He would be let in by a guard Elara didn't recognize, a man with a shifty look who was never at the main gate. She watched this happen 3 days in a row. Each time, her feeling of dread grew stronger. On the 4th day, as she watched the thin man leave, she saw something else. A face at that small, half-open window on the 3rd floor. It was there for only a second, a pale blur against the darkness inside. But Elara knew. It was the prince. He looked so small, so fragile. He looked out. Not at the grand city or the glittering towers, but down, towards the main gate, towards the guards, towards the only hope of order in his chaotic, terrifying world. And then, as if a hand had pulled him back, he was gone. Elara knew then that she had to do something. She was just a child, a laundress's daughter. Who would listen to her? She couldn't get into the palace. She couldn't speak to the queen. But she could speak to the guards. They were the only ones who stood between the outside world and the secrets within. They were the only ones who had the power to act. The plan, if it could be called that, formed slowly in her mind over the next few days. It was a simple, desperate idea, born of a child's logic. She needed to get their attention. But not by shouting or waving. That had never worked. She needed a signal, on something that would stand out from the endless, chaotic movement of the city, something that would make them see her, really see her, and understand that she had a message that was more important than the traffic of carts and the chatter of the market. She found her answer in her mother's small sewing box. Among the needles and thread was a tiny handheld mirror, its silver backing worn and speckled. Her mother used it to check her appearance before she left for work, to smooth her hair and pinch some color into her cheeks. Elara took it carefully. She held it in her palm, feeling its cool weight. A flash of light. That was it. A flash of light could travel far, faster than a shout, brighter than a wave. It could be a secret message just between her and them. The next morning, as the sun climbed higher and began to pour its golden light over the city, Elara positioned herself on the roof. She waited until the guards changed shift, until Gregor and Stefan, as she called them, were in their familiar places. The sun was at her back, perfect for her plan. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her palms were sweaty, and she had to keep wiping them on her dress. She felt a knot of fear in her stomach. What if she was wrong? What if the guards just ignored her? What if they thought she was just a silly child playing a game? But then she thought of the pale face at the window, the boy who was a prisoner in his own home, and her fear solidified into a cold, hard determination. Holding her breath, she raised the small mirror. She angled it carefully, just as she had practiced. Catching the sun's rays and aiming the brilliant, concentrated beam of light directly at the main gate. At the guard she had named Stefan. The spot of light danced for a moment on the cobblestones before finding its mark, landing squarely on the polished silver of his breastplate. It was a tiny thing, a fleeting glint, but in the ordered, monotonous world of a palace guard, it was a glaring anomaly. The guard's head moved. Just a fraction. His eyes, hidden beneath the helmet's brim, scanned the city. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She did it again. A short, deliberate flash, then another. She wasn't just waving a light around. She was signaling. She was trying to speak. She aimed the light at the gate, then at the small, half-open window on the third floor, back to the gate, back to the window. She was trying to draw a connection. To tell him, look there. That's where you need to look. The guard, the one she called Stefan, did something he had never done in all the months Elara had been watching. He tilted his head up. He looked not at the general chaos of the city, but directly at the rooftops. He was searching for the source of the light. Elara's heart soared. He had seen. He was looking. She wanted to jump and shout for joy, but she forced herself to stay focused. She gave one last long flash, aiming it as clearly as she could at the small open window. Then she lowered the mirror, ducked behind the low wall, and waited, trembling. For a long moment, nothing happened. The guard, Stefan, returned his gaze to the square. He was as still as ever. Elara felt a wave of crushing disappointment. He hadn't understood. It was just a trick of the light to him. She had failed. She sat on the roof, hugging her knees, feeling the sharp sting of tears. She had been so sure, so hopeful, but she was just a little girl. What could she possibly do? But she hadn't failed. Down at the main gate, guard Stefan, whose real name was Kyle, had not dismissed the flash of light. He was a young man, but he was not a fool. He had been trained to notice anomalies, to question the ordinary. A single stray flash of light from a window was nothing. But a deliberate, repeated pattern of light, aimed with such purpose, that was something else entirely. He didn't look again. He didn't want to alert anyone who might be watching him, but in his mind, he replayed the sequence. Gate, window, gate, window. It was a message, and it had come from that same rooftop where he sometimes noticed a tiny figure waving. And the laundress's child. Cale waited until his shift ended. He said nothing to his partner, the older, more cynical guard who would have laughed at his suspicions. He simply walked away, disappearing into the warren of streets behind the palace. He made his way with difficulty to the old building Alara lived in. He climbed the creaking stairs and knocked on the only door at the top. When a terrified Alara opened it, expecting a neighbor or a landlord, she found herself staring up at the tall, silver breastplated figure from the gate. He wasn't a statue. He was real, and he was here. He knelt down, bringing his face level with hers. His eyes, she saw, were kind. "The light," he said, his voice low and gentle. "What were you trying to tell me?" What followed was a cascade of words from Alara. She told him everything. About her mother. Knew about the strange man in the black carriage. About the dismissed nurse, the open window, and the pale, sick face of the prince. She spoke of the prison, of the bad man making him sleep. Kyle listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each word. He was just a guard, a lowly sentinel at the gate. He had no authority to enter the royal apartments, no power to question the physicians. But he had a duty, not just to the palace, but to the boy within it. He believed the child. Her fear was too real, her story too detailed to be a fantasy. He couldn't storm the gates. He couldn't make accusations without proof. But he could watch. And for the next 2 days, he did. On his off hours, he positioned himself where he could see the small, unmarked gate. He saw the black carriage arrive. He saw the thin, dark-coated man slip inside. And he saw the shifty-eyed guard who let him in. And on the second day, he saw something else. A maid, a girl he recognized from the kitchens, scurrying out of that same gate, her face pale with terror, clutching a small bundle. She looked around, saw Kyle watching from the shadows, and froze. Then, without a word, she dropped the bundle and ran. Kyle walked over and picked it up. Inside, wrapped in a kitchen rag, was a small silver spoon. But it wasn't just any spoon. It was engraved with the royal crest, and it was smeared with a dark, sticky residue that was definitely not food. It was medicine, or poison. He didn't know which, but it was evidence. It was proof that something was deeply, dangerously wrong. He couldn't go to his captain. The captain was a political appointee, a man who valued his position more than the truth. He had to go higher. He had to go to the one person whose authority was beyond question, whose love for her son was the only thing that could pierce the veil of secrecy. He had to go to the queen. Getting an audience was nearly impossible. He was a common guard. He was turned away by secretaries, ignored by chamberlains. But Kale was persistent. He used every scrap of knowledge he had, every back corridor he knew from his years of service. He finally managed to get a message to the queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting, an older woman who had known the prince since he was a baby. He showed her the spoon. He told her the little girl's story. That evening, Alara and her mother were summoned to the palace. They were not taken to the kitchens or the laundries. They were led through gilded corridors, past paintings of stern-faced kings, onto a small, private sitting room. Inside, sitting by a fire, was the queen. She was not the cold, distant beauty Alara's mother had described. She was a woman with red-rimmed eyes and a face carved by worry. Beside her stood Kale. The queen asked Alara to tell her story, and Alara did, just as she had told it to the guard on her doorstep. When she finished, the queen's face was pale, but her eyes were hard as diamonds. She turned to Kale. "Bring me this physician," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "Bring him to me now." The thin man in the dark coat was found in the prince's chambers, preparing another sleeping draught. He was escorted, not gently, to the queen's sitting room. The spoon was produced. The shifty-eyed guard, quickly apprehended and questioned, confessed to being paid to look the other way. The physician, so confronted with the evidence and the terrified testimony of the maid who had fled, crumbled. He had been hired by a distant, ambitious cousin of the king, a man who would be next in line for the throne if the young, frail prince were to tragically succumb to his mysterious illness. The plot was exposed. The physician was imprisoned, the treacherous cousin was exiled, and the young prince, freed from the potions that were slowly killing him, began, under the care of a new trusted physician, to recover his strength. The window that had been his prison was thrown open, and fresh air, real air, filled his room. A few weeks later, Ilara and her mother were again summoned to the palace. This time, they were led to a sunny room in one of the towers. Sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket but with color in his cheeks and a curious light in his eyes, was the prince. He was small and thin, just as Ilara had imagined, but his smile was wide and genuine. He looked at her, this strange girl in her simple, clean dress, and he saw not a laundress's daughter, but a friend, an equal, the person who had saved his life. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He simply pointed to the window, which looked out over the city, and then to the distant, crooked rooftop where a little girl had once sat and watched. He knew. He understood the signal of light, the bridge of hope that had connected their two worlds. Ilara's mother was given a new position, a comfortable one as a supervisor in the royal linen store with a small, clean apartment in the palace grounds. She never had to worry about money or a roof over their heads again. But for Ilara, the greatest reward was not the comfort or the security. It was the friendship of a lonely boy in a tower. She would visit him often, and they would sit by the window, looking out at the city she had once watched from so far away. And whenever they saw the guards at the main gate, the sun glinting off their silver breastplates, they would remember the day a little girl's secret signal had changed everything. The city of Valdris never knew the full story. To them, it was just a rumor, a whisper about a court intrigue that had been quietly resolved. But on the roof of a now empty building, a small, forgotten mirror still lay where Ilara had left it, a silent testament to the courage of a child who dared to send a message. Yes, and the honor of a guard who chose to see it.